If you ever take an independent contract job that pays triple the standard rate simply because the location is considered remote, do yourself a favor and check the satellite maps first. Look at the surrounding area. See how far the nearest neighbor actually is. I didn't do that, and it is a mistake I still think about every time I have to drive down an empty road at night. In the late fall of 2019, I was working as a freelance property photographer for a regional bank based in Pennsylvania. The job was straightforward, if a bit depressing. When a homeowner defaulted and the bank foreclosed, the property usually sat empty for months. Before they could put it up for auction, they needed an updated assessment of the interior. They needed to know if the pipes had burst, if squatters had moved in, or if the previous owners had stripped the copper wiring before leaving. My job was just to walk in, take wide-angle photos of every single room, log any obvious damage on a checklist, and leave. I usually got paid about $80 per house. Then, on a Tuesday morning in November, I got an email from the asset manager I usually reported to. He had a rush job, a property up in the dense wooded hills near the Allegheny National Forest. It had been sitting in legal limbo for over a year and a half, and they finally had the clearance to list it. Because it was a 2-hour drive from my usual zone, the payout was listed at $300. I was 26, my rent was due in a week, and I drove a reliable Toyota. I accepted the job immediately. The drive was entirely unremarkable for the first 90 minutes, but once I got off the main highway, the roads started to narrow. Pavement turned into packed dirt, and the tree canopy above grew so thick that it actually blocked out the mid-afternoon sun. By the time my GPS told me to turn onto the private driveway, it felt like it was already evening. The driveway was nearly a mile long, winding uphill through a dense corridor of bare gray trees. When I finally reached the clearing at the top, I put the car in park and just sat there for a minute, looking at the house. It wasn't a creepy Gothic mansion. It was a relatively modern, custom-built home, probably constructed sometime in the early 2000s. It had a lot of dark wood siding and large geometric windows, but the isolation of it was absolute. There were no power lines visible. It must have been on a localized grid or generator. The nearest town was 30 miles behind me. The silence when I turned off my engine was so heavy, it almost made my ears ring. I grabbed my DSLR camera, my flashlight, and my clipboard and walked up to the front porch. The bank had given me the code for the realtor lockbox hanging on the front doorknob. I punched in the code, the box popped open. I took out the silver key, slid it into the deadbolt, and turned it. It was stiff, protesting against the lack of use, but it clicked open. I pushed the door inward. The air inside hit me immediately, but it wasn't the smell I was expecting. Usually, foreclosed homes that have sat empty for 18 months smell like stale dust, dead insects, and dry rot. This house didn't smell like that. The air was cold, but it felt strangely heavy, almost humid. "Hello?" I called out, purely out of habit. The bank strictly required us to announce ourselves, just in case a squatter was inside. "Property management. Anyone here?" My voice echoed off the hardwood floors and died in the hallway. No answer. I turned on my camera and started my routine. The bank's rules were very rigid. You had to document a logical flow of the house so the risk assessors didn't get confused. Start at the front door, living room, kitchen, hallways, bedrooms, bathrooms, basement, garage. I moved methodically. The living room was empty except for a single cheap folding chair sitting dead center on the carpet. I noted it, photographed it, and moved on. The kitchen was surprisingly clean. The refrigerator was propped open to prevent mold, standard practice. The layout of the house was simple. The main floor held the living spaces, the second floor had 3 bedrooms, and a door in the main hallway led down to a finished basement and utility room. I finished the upper floors in about 20 minutes. The house was structurally sound. Aside from that single cheap folding chair downstairs, it was completely empty. No trash, no forgotten clothes in the closets, just bare walls and vacuum lines still visible in the carpets. I went back down to the main floor to finish the basement. I walked down the hallway and found the basement door.
This was where I encountered the first thing that actually made me stop and lower my camera. The door was heavy, solid wood, but it had a steel slide bolt installed on the outside, the hallway side, and hanging from that steel slide bolt was a heavy-duty master lock. I stood there staring at it, trying to make it sense. You put a lock on the outside of a door to keep whatever's inside from getting out. I checked my clipboard. The bank needed a photo of the water heater and the HVAC unit to confirm they hadn't been stolen. Both were listed as being in the basement. If I didn't get those photos, the job would be marked incomplete and I wouldn't get my $300. I walked out to my car, opened the trunk, and grabbed the pair of 24-inch bolt cutters I kept next to my spare tire. In foreclosure work, cutting padlocks off exterior gates or utility sheds was a weekly occurrence. I walked back inside, fitted the heavy metal jaws of the cutters over the shackle of the padlock, and squeezed the handles together. With a sharp crack, the lock snapped. I pulled it off, slid the heavy metal bolt back, and grabbed the doorknob. I turned it and pulled the door open. The staircase leading down was pitch black. I reached for the light switch on the wall and flipped it. Nothing happened. The breaker for the basement was likely off. I turned on my heavy-duty mag-light flashlight and shined it down the wooden stairs. They were wet. Not damp from a leak. They were distinct, fresh, wet footprints leading from the darkness at the bottom of the stairs, coming exactly halfway up the steps, and then turning around and going back down. And drifting up from the black void of the basement was the unmistakable, eye-watering chemical smell of industrial bleach. Would you like me to continue with part 2? I stood at the top of the stairs for a long time, just breathing through my mouth. The smell of bleach was so strong it actually stung my eyes. My brain immediately tried to piece together a logical explanation. In foreclosed homes, banks often hire preservation crews to winterize the property before listing it. They drain the pipes, pour pink antifreeze into the toilets, and sometimes bleach the basement if there is a severe mold issue from sitting closed up for a year. That explained the smell. It could also explain the lock. Bank contractors sometimes put padlocks on utility doors to keep copper thieves out of the basement where the valuable appliances are kept. As for the footprints, a worker probably walked up, realized he forgot a tool, went back down, and then eventually left through a basement bulkhead door. It made sense. It was a completely realistic sequence of events. But standing there in the heavy silence of that house, looking into the pitch-black stairwell, my stomach was still in knots. I looked at my watch. It was 3:15 p.m. The sun would start setting over the mountains in about an hour, and I had a long drive back. If I walked away now, the job would be marked as incomplete. I wouldn't get my $300, and I'd probably lose favor with the asset manager who gave me the high-paying gigs. All I needed were 2 clear photos, the HVAC unit and the water heater. That was it. I could be down and back up in less than 60 seconds. I tightened my grip on the heavy mag light in my left hand and held my camera in my right. I stepped over the wet footprints on the wooden treads, keeping my back close to the wall. The stairs creaked loudly under my weight, each sound echoing sharply in the empty space below. When I reached the bottom, I swept my flashlight across the room. It was a standard, unfinished concrete basement. It ran the entire length of the house. The walls were bare cinder block. Support pillars dotted the center of the room. There were no windows, just a heavy darkness that my flashlight beam had to fight through. The wet footprints on the floor trailed off toward the far left corner. That was also where the smell of bleach was originating. I shined my light to the right. Sitting against the wall was the large silver box of the HVAC unit. Perfect. I walked over quickly, raised my camera, and hit the shutter. The flash went off, a blinding burst of white light that temporarily washed out the room and left purple spots dancing in my vision. 1 photo down, 1 to go. I turned and swept my flashlight toward the left side of the basement to find the water heater. I spotted the tall cylindrical tank sitting in the far corner. But I also saw what was directly in front of it. Spread out over the concrete floor was a massive sheet of thick black plastic tarp. It looked brand new. Next to the tarp was a heavy-duty yellow mop bucket, the kind you see janitors using in schools. I walked a few steps closer, my boots making dull scraping sounds against the concrete. The water in the yellow bucket was dark. It wasn't the cloudy gray of dirty mop water. It was a thick, rusty, dark red. The mop itself was leaning against the cinder block wall, its stringy head heavily stained with the same dark reddish-brown color. My chest felt tight. I stopped moving. The logical side of my brain was starting to fail me. Preservation crews do not use black plastic tarps, and they don't mop concrete basement floors. I wanted to run. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, run up those stairs, get in my car, and drive until I hit the highway. But I was literally 15 feet away from the water heater. I just needed the photo, one press of a button. I held my breath, brought the camera up to my eye, and pointed it at the water heater. I couldn't see perfectly in the dark, so I relied on the camera's autofocus. A thin red laser grid shot out from the front of the camera, mapping the darkness to find the subject. It locked on. It beeped. I pressed the button. Flash! The room lit up brilliantly for a fraction of a second, casting harsh, sudden shadows against the walls, and then plunged immediately back into darkness. I lowered the camera, my heart hammering against my ribs. I turned around immediately and started walking fast toward the stairs. As I walked, I looked down at the bright LCD screen on the back of my camera to make sure the photo of the water heater wasn't blurry. I stopped dead in my tracks. I zoomed in on the image on the little screen. The flash had illuminated the water heater perfectly, but it had also illuminated the thick concrete support pillar standing about 10 feet behind it. Peeking out from the bottom edge of that concrete pillar, clearly visible in the harsh white light of the camera flash, was the toe of a black leather work boot. Someone was standing behind the pillar. I slowly lowered the camera. I didn't make a sound. I raised my heavy metal flashlight, my hand trembling violently, and pointed the beam directly at the pillar across the room. The tip of the black boot was still there. And then, very slowly, I heard the subtle, distinct sound of a shoe shifting against the concrete floor.
I didn't yell out. I didn't ask if anyone was there. If someone is standing silently behind a concrete pillar in a pitch-black basement while you take flash photography, they are not a fellow contractor, and they are not there to be friendly. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. I kept the heavy mag light pointed steady at the edge of the pillar. The black work boot didn't move again. It just stayed perfectly still, as if the person wearing it was holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I didn't turn my back. I slowly took one step backward toward the staircase. My rubber sole scraped lightly against the concrete floor. The moment I made that sound, the boot quickly pulled back behind the pillar, completely out of sight. Whoever it was, they knew I had seen them, and they were actively trying to stay hidden. That was it. The logical side of my brain completely shut off, and pure survival instinct took over. I took another step back, my heel hitting the bottom wooden stair. The wood gave a loud, agonizing creak. I didn't care about the wet steps anymore. I turned around and started taking the stairs two at a time. I kept my camera tight against my chest so it wouldn't hit the railing, using my left hand to pull myself up the steep incline as fast as I could. The heavy darkness of the basement felt like it was pressing against my back. I reached the top landing in seconds. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. My immediate thought was to shut the heavy wooden door, slide that thick metal bolt across, and trap whoever it was down there. I grabbed the doorknob and threw my weight into it, pulling the door shut. But right as the door was an inch away from closing, I heard a sound that made my blood run completely cold. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a threat. It was the heavy, frantic sound of boots sprinting up the wooden stairs, coming directly toward me in the dark.
I threw my entire body weight against the heavy wood. Just as the door met the frame, a massive force slammed into the other side. The impact was so violent, it actually bounced my shoulder back an inch. The wood groaned, and the door hinges rattled aggressively. I pushed back with everything I had, my rubber boots sliding slightly on the hardwood floor. I dropped my camera so it hung by its neck strap, reached out with my free hand, grabbed the thick steel slide bolt, and shoved it across. It slid into the metal bracket with a loud final clack. I stumbled backward, gasping for air. I kept the heavy mag light pointed directly at the door. I expected loud pounding. I expected whoever it was to start shouting or to start throwing their shoulder against the wood to break it down. But they didn't. Instead, the brass doorknob slowly turned. It rotated all the way to the right. Then it stopped. There was a faint metallic shifting sound as the person on the other side gently pushed against the wood, testing the bolt. They weren't panicked. They were just calmly checking to see if they were actually trapped. That quiet, methodical turning of the knob terrified me more than any screaming would have. I didn't wait to see what they would do next. I turned around and sprinted down the main hallway toward the front entrance. My only thought was getting to my car, locking the doors, and driving blindly down that dirt mountain road until my phone caught a cell signal so I could dial 911. I reached the front door. I grabbed the handle and yanked it backward. It didn't open. I pulled it again, harder this time. The door barely rattled. I shined my flashlight down at the locking mechanism to see if it was just stuck. It wasn't stuck. The heavy brass deadbolt was turned horizontally. It was locked from the inside. My stomach completely dropped. When I entered the house 20 minutes ago, I had used the silver key from the lockbox to open it. I knew for an absolute fact that I had not turned the deadbolt behind me. As a property photographer doing foreclosure gigs, leaving the door unlocked while you work so you can exit quickly is an unwritten survival rule. Someone had locked it after I came inside. I reached out to twist the deadbolt open, but my hand froze mid-air. A sudden cold realization hit me, a detail my panicked brain had pushed aside. The heavy master lock that I had cut off with my bolt cutters. It had been secured on the hallway side of the basement door. The person in the basement hadn't locked themselves down there. Someone else had locked them in. I slowly turned around, my back pressed flat against the locked front door. I raised my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the dark, empty living room and the shadows of the open kitchen. There was a second person in the house.
I didn't move a single muscle. My brain felt like it was short-circuiting. I stood there with my back pressed against the cold wood of the front door, pointing my flashlight blindly into the empty living room. If someone was locked in the basement and someone else had locked the front door behind me, where was the second person? The house was dead silent. I held my breath, straining my ears for any sound over the rushing of blood in my head. Then I heard it. It wasn't coming from the basement. It wasn't coming from the kitchen. It came from directly above me. Creak. A heavy, deliberate footstep pressed down on the floorboards of the second floor, the exact floor I had been walking around taking pictures of just 10 minutes earlier. Creak. Another step, slow, methodical, moving toward the top of the main staircase. I didn't try to be quiet anymore. I reached behind me, grabbed the deadbolt, and twisted it hard. The lock was stiff, and it let out a loud, sharp metal snap that echoed through the entire first floor. The moment I made that noise, the slow footsteps upstairs instantly stopped. For one terrifying second, there was absolute silence. Then, the heavy thudding of boots started sprinting down the carpeted stairs. I threw the front door open, not even bothering to shut it behind me, and bolted across the wooden porch. I cleared the steps in one jump and hit the dirt driveway, running faster than I ever have in my entire life. The sun had dipped below the tree line now, turning the dense woods into a wall of dark gray shadows.
My car was parked about 50 feet away in the clearing. I dug my hand into my jacket pocket, my fingers desperately searching for my keys. I felt the cold metal of the fob, pulled it out, and hit the unlock button. The yellow headlights flashed, the doors unlocked with a double chirp. I reached the driver's side door, yanked it open, tossed my camera and flashlight into the passenger seat, and threw myself behind the wheel. I slammed the door shut and immediately slapped the master lock button on the armrest. Click. All 4 doors locked. I was enclosed in steel and glass, safe. I was gasping for air, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the car key. I shoved it into the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life. My headlights cut through the gathering dark, illuminating the thick tree trunks at the edge of the driveway. I shifted the car into reverse to turn around and get out of there. I looked up into my rearview mirror to check the space behind me. I slammed my foot on the brake pedal. Standing perfectly still in the red glow of my taillights, directly blocking my car from backing up, was a tall figure wearing a dark coat, and in their right hand, trailing down by their leg, they were holding the heavy 24-inch iron bolt cutters I had left in the hallway. I didn't honk the horn, I didn't roll down the window to yell at him. I just stared at the heavy iron bolt cutters dangling from his right hand, my bolt cutters, the ones I had left sitting on the hardwood floor in the main hallway. He didn't raise them, he didn't run toward my car. He just stood there in the center of the driveway, illuminated by the red glare of my brake lights, blocking my only way out in reverse. My brain processed the geometry of the situation in less than a second. I didn't need to go in reverse. I slammed the gear shift from reverse into drive. I cranked the steering wheel as hard as I could to the right and stomped on the gas pedal. The Toyota's engine whined loudly. The tires spun for a fraction of a second on the packed dirt before catching. The car lunged forward, jumping the small stone border of the driveway and plowing directly into the overgrown grass of the front lawn. I bounced violently in my seat as the car hit uneven ground and hidden rocks. My headlights swept wildly across the dark trees, the side of the house, and the empty porch. I kept my foot pressed down, steering in a wide, erratic half-circle across the yard until the headlights lined back up with the dirt road leading down the mountain. As the tires hit the dirt path, I looked in my rearview mirror one last time. The man in the dark coat hadn't moved to chase me. He was just standing exactly where I had left him, watching my taillights disappear into the trees. I drove that mountain road with zero regard for my car's suspension. I hit potholes that violently rattled my teeth. I scraped low-hanging branches. I didn't take my foot off the accelerator until I hit the paved highway at the bottom of the ridge. I drove for another 20 miles until I saw the bright fluorescent lights of a 24-hour gas station. I pulled into a parking space right next to the front doors, locked the car again, and dialed 911. The dispatcher sent a state trooper to the gas station. I sat in the front seat of his cruiser and gave him the exact address, the gate code, and a detailed description of everything I had seen: the broken padlock, the tarp, the bucket of dark red water, the boot behind the pillar, and the man with the bolt cutters. Because of the mention of suspected blood, they didn't wait until morning. 2 state police cruisers drove up to the property that night. I sat at the gas station for 3 hours waiting for an update. Finally, the trooper called my cell phone. The house was completely empty. There was no man in a dark coat. There was no one in the basement. The heavy plastic tarp and the yellow mop bucket were gone. Only things the police found were my bolt cutters tossed into the tall grass near the front porch and the broken master lock sitting on the hallway floor. But they didn't write it off as a prank or a misunderstanding. The trooper told me that when they went down into the basement, the smell of industrial bleach was still so strong it burned their throats. They called out a crime scene technician the next morning to spray the concrete floor with luminol. The entire left side of the basement lit up like a Christmas tree. According to the detective who interviewed me a week later, someone had been using that abandoned foreclosed house for something incredibly violent. Given the sheer amount of blood evidence they found soaked into the microscopic pores of the concrete, they were treating it as a homicide disposal site. The criminals had specifically chosen a bank-owned property that had been sitting untouched for 18 months. It was the perfect, isolated location. They had no idea the bank had randomly assigned a freelancer to come take photos that exact Tuesday afternoon. I never got my $300 for that job. I quit doing property photography entirely by the end of that month. But there is one specific detail from that day that still keeps me awake at night. It's the reason I always double-check the locks on my own doors. When I was standing in the living room, terrified, I thought the person upstairs had locked the front deadbolt to trap me inside with the person in the basement. But the detective pointed out something I had missed in my panic. If the person upstairs wanted to trap me, they would have just stayed quiet. They wouldn't have locked the front door, knowing the deadbolt makes a loud snapping sound. They locked the front door because they heard the basement door open. They heard me break the padlock. The person upstairs wasn't trying to trap me. They were locking the front door to protect themselves from whatever I had just let out of the basement. If you ever find yourself taking a job in the middle of nowhere, just remember, some doors are locked for your own protection, not yours. If this story made you double-check your own deadbolts tonight, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next dive into the dark side of reality. Have you ever experienced something deeply unsettling while working alone, or found something you weren't supposed to see? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read each one of them. Until next time, stay safe and always trust your instincts.